Hello, this is Rusty. Welcome to another video. I'm looking at Sean McDowell's video here, Best Questions to Ask an Atheist. I've done a couple of takes already, and I think it might have gone a little bit too long, so I'm going to try again, except more concisely. Lead off, please, Sean, with your first question.
Best questions to ask an atheist? What do you mean by atheism?
I mean by atheism that someone either believes that a proposition is true or doesn't believe that a proposition is true. And there are two different propositions in play here, which causes some confusion. So the first proposition is, it is the case that a God exists, and an atheist does not believe that proposition. The second proposition is, it is not the case that at least one God exists, and atheists may believe that proposition. They also might not be convinced by that one either. So because these two propositions are considered in concert, then you might have somebody who looks at the first proposition, it is the case that God exists, and does not believe it. And they look at the second proposition, it is not the case that God exists, and are not convinced by that. So they don't have enough evidence to say God doesn't exist, but they're not convinced that it is the case that a God does. So these two propositions create a tug of war. But it's even more complicated than that, because belief isn't an either or. It's not either you do believe something or you don't believe something. It's like a tug of war. So you're more strongly drawn towards belief, or you're more strongly drawn towards disbelief. And if you're somewhere in the middle, it can be hard to tell which you are closer to. So you might suspend judgment. And that can be because either the evidence is so weak, it's not moving the needle, or both their belief and disbelief, are equal in how much evidence they have, and they're equally pulling so that the needle doesn't move either, because there's just some more tension in the scale of belief. So the evidence is pulling, but it's not moving the needle because it's pulling equally in both directions, and you are unable to make an assessment over which evidence is more reliable. So, and then you have both propositions, of course. So you have that tug of war happening in both propositions at the same time. And if you have the first proposition, it is the case that at least one God exists, and the evidence is pulling strongly towards disbelief in that proposition, and yet you have the second proposition, it is not the case that at least one God exists, and you have no tension on that rib at all. Your needle isn't moving. You're not convinced by that proposition. Then you have a somewhat difficult decision to make, which is the stronger pull. The not believing a God does exist, or believing that God doesn't exist. And a lot of atheists prefer to tread water a little bit and not overextend themselves. So they will opt to say they're not convinced that a God does exist, but they're equally not convinced that God doesn't exist. And that is what happens in atheism.
When did you become an atheist?
Somewhere after 2001, I'm not sure how much after it was. A year, 2 years, it's not clear to me. I had trouble with depression at the time, and my mind was a bit of a mess. So I'm not really clear on exactly what was going on at the time. My memories are quite fuzzy. So somewhere after that time, I realized that I no longer believed in God at all.
Did you ever believe in God?
Yes, but maybe no. So looking back, I might have been performative. I might have been attempting to meet social and familial expectations as regards what they expected I ought to believe, what I was being taught I should believe. So I was being taught things about the Bible and Scripture and the Christian message, and I was expected that I ought to believe it, and I was given to present on topics from the Bible, my thoughts on them, but they also had to conform to the teachings of that organization. So they were all monitored, and you weren't allowed any room for personal expression or for studying outside of the group's dogma. Everything had to be within the confines of the dogma of the faith. So there was no open exploration of all the sources available to Bible scholars or anything like that. You were told, these are the materials that you can study, and this is the conclusion that you have to come to. And it's, in essence, a form of costly signaling that you go through this ritual of performative study in Christianity and showing loyalty to the group and repeating the answers that they expect you to repeat. And one of those answers was belief in God. That you think that the Bible has a master plan, that it's inerrant, that everything within it is leading up to a final showdown at Armageddon between God and the demonic forces led by Satan and all this, which is utterly nonsense. The Bible was never written like that. So, what's your next question?
What's your experience with Christians?
Mostly positive, because I live in England. We don't have the toxic kind anywhere more as frequently here as over in the States. So most of the Christians over here are charitable and community spirited, which means we are able to have good relationships even though we don't agree on theology.
What, if anything, might cause you to reconsider your beliefs?
So what it would take for me to consider my beliefs might be wrong is all of modern scholarship being wrong and all of modern archaeology being wrong. So the overwhelming data that has arisen in the 21st and late 20th century points away from Christianity. It points to that the texts that form the early Bible were entirely not true. They're not historical. The earliest teachings about science in the Bible were not how the world was. It's a flat earth text. It believed in a firmament. It believed that the earth was hanging on nothing, which isn't the same as gravity. Note, gravity is when the earth is in free fall. It believed that the stars were set in the firmament as little twinkly objects. It thought that planets were wandering stars, just like the Greeks, basically. The Greeks were more finessed, but they still had this idea of the seven heavens, which were the bodies of the planets that you could see from Earth. It taught that the sun was a light and the moon was a lesser light, the sun for the day and the moon for the night, which is, of course, wrong, because the moon is equally out in the daytime. And it taught that special creation was true in two different ways, because there are two different creation accounts. So what we've discovered is that special creation is completely wrong and evolution is true. We've also discovered that the flood didn't happen. The conquest of Canaan didn't happen, at least the way the Bible describes it for certain. The Exodus didn't happen as the Bible describes it, that most of the patriarchs probably didn't exist at all. And we don't really have any evidence that we can rely on until we get to the Dan Steely, the Tell Dan Steely, I think, which mentions the house of David and his descendants. There's another one similar to it, but I forget the name of. So we're way up into the 10th century or thereabouts, maybe the 11th, before we have anything that's properly concrete. And it appears to be the case that most of the stories in the Bible before that were completely fictional. There's no evidence that points to any of the stories before that having any truth in them at all. Now, it does name drop people like Pharaoh, but what I'm talking about is the stories. So obviously Egypt is a real place, Pharaoh is a real place, world leaders that it might call up were real people. I'm talking about the stories not being true. So you'd have to overturn all of modern scholarship.
Those are the kinds of questions I like to begin with. Now, eventually, I want to get to the big question. Why is there something rather than nothing?
I don't think that nothing is a possible state that could obtain, which is why there is something, because there can't be nothing. I think it might be that simple an answer. The reason there's something rather than nothing is that nothing could never be a state that obtained. There's always been something, and what that something might be could be, as cosmologists might say, a quantum foam, but it could equally be a cosmos, a multiverse, brains with an A-N-E-S. So there are a number of different explanations of what could be, and none of them are nothing. So I don't think it is likely that a state of nothingness is something that could obtain.
Where did life come from?
And the simplest answer to that question would probably be biochemistry. Biochemistry would be a consequence of organic chemistry. Organic chemistry would be a consequence of simple chemistry. And chemistry itself comes from physics. So you put all of those in place, then they lead inexorably to self-replicating molecules if the conditions are right. So you'd have to have water present, right ambient temperatures. It might need some, I want to say enzymes, but that's the wrong word. Catalysts. If we're talking about chemistry, and before life exists, we're talking about catalysts rather than enzymes, and so on. So once the conditions are right, and then chemistry and biochemistry will just simply yield life. And the reason I think that is because we see organic chemistry in space. It's something you can find on meteors and comets, I think. It's extraplanetary bodies anyway, extraterran bodies. So it could be meteors, comets, asteroids, and I forget exactly which ones they are, but that's what I'm talking about, that particular set of objects.
The origin of consciousness.
Consciousness appears to be emergent from the material brain, although if we keep technologically advancing, we might be also able to yield consciousness within machines too. So we could say that it appears to be emergent from material, but at the moment, we've only seen it emerge from brains. And we don't see consciousness in the absence of brains, which is essential to the Christian argument. We have no examples currently as to how it is possible to have consciousness in the absence of a physical brain. And that is essential for showing that God can be immaterial, timeless, and spaceless, and yet still make decisions, and yet still have opinions, and yet still have will, and yet still have a purpose, and yet still want a loving relationship with humans, and be a being at all.
Objective moral values and duties.
Well, objective moral values and duties, if you want to use the word objective, you first have to subjectively choose what framework you're talking about. Because in order to measure objectively morals and duties, then you are saying this is what our metric is. And you're doing that subjectively, just arbitrarily picking a standard. Saying, so if it's human well-being, for instance, you are choosing well-being as your standard in order to measure morals and duties against it. So you can do that, of course. You could say theft is wrong because it has a cost. And that cost is it damages livelihoods or has a financial cost to police, the justice system, jail space, insurances, and so forth. You can talk about the financial costs. You can talk about impacts on livelihoods. But all of these, you have to first say what your standard is that you're measuring against, because you can't simply derive an objective moral value or an objective duty from the universe and apply it to human behavior. And the idea that God can do this is nonsense, because God is still subjective. If you want to appeal to God's nature, then you have to show that God has a nature. And that would mean actually showing that God exists. You can't simply define God's nature without showing that God exists at all. And you have to be able to describe in some way how it is rational to talk about moral values and duties being objective and tied to God's nature and why we ought to follow those. So you might simply be created a tautology that it is good because it's good, that God is irrelevant to the question. When you try and pin down what it is about God's nature that makes something moral, or that this moral duty is something that we ought to do. And the consequence can be that you simply rule God out, that you just cancels out. And then you're left with, that's how the world ought to be. Well, that's nice. But you just eliminated God in the process and showed that he's not relevant to the question of morality, that things are moral or things are not moral, and God is independent of that. And that he can enforce it, he can assert his opinion and his will. Unfortunately, when we study the Bible, it turns out that his will seems to contradict what we think is moral in the earliest of the stories, in the Hebrew scriptures, quite often. So what God asserts that he wants is not something that we would hold to be moral if any other being did it, which belies the idea that it's objective.
And who is Jesus? But to me, those questions are often...
Stop. Jesus was an itinerant preacher in the first century, who was an apocalyptic preacher who upset the Romans and was probably charged with sedition and executed. He might have had some thought-provoking things that he said, and they might hold value for us today and be pertinent to a productive society, but they are not things that we couldn't have elaborated without him. And many societies did, in fact, have similar values to those that Jesus was teaching. We also might be able to improve on them. So one of the ways that you could improve on that is take the golden rule and make it platinum. So the idea that you treat people like you ought to be treated can be changed to you treat people how they would want to be treated, for instance. And there's a silver rule as well, for instance, that you don't treat people how they wouldn't want to be treated. Now, all of these presuppose that we're not taking the opinions of psychopaths and sociopaths and narcissists into account. We're talking about a normal, rational human being, and that they have reasonable expectations of how they ought to be treated or how they would wish that you would treat them. So we're not talking about sadomasochism either. Just ordinary, rational, everyday human experience, and not talking about the extremes of human behavior.
Often downstream from first getting to know the person and hearing their story.
Okay, well, thank you, Sean. And my story is that I was once Christian and decided it was not a rational take on the world. And I experienced in my 20s some cognitive dissonance and some severe depression, and was left quite confused for some time and fought depression for quite a long time, and then decided that in order to fulfill my potential, I would have to change myself. And I started to put myself back together again, reinvent myself, and aspire to living a virtuous life, and then reconstructed what I thought values mattered and what I wanted to attain, how I wanted to treat other people, what I thought I ought to treat other people like, across all relationships, so that I could be a person that people would point to and say, there's a gentleman. That's how you should be treating people. That is what civility means. That is what being charitable means. That's what kindness means. And that's hard. It turns out that is extremely hard. And I'll probably never match the ideal that I set up for myself. But as long as I'm moving forward, I'm happy. As long as I am extolling living a virtuous and fulfilling life, and that other people are happier because of my presence and my involvement with them, then I will have succeeded in the aspirations that I set for myself, to save myself from depression and recreate a more appropriate life for myself. So I think I'm going the right way. I think I've made some progress. And despite the fact that I think Christianity isn't true, I didn't abandon my set of values. In fact, I've improved on them. I have a more rational take on the world and how I fit in it. I also left myself with some obligations that I didn't necessarily have as a Christian, because Christians think the world is going to come to an end anyway. So why get involved? Why worry about energy crises? Why worry about the climate if the world is going to pass away anyway, and a new earth and a new heavens are going to be created by God? None of these things matter, so why should you try? I decided that was not a rational take, and that 2,000 years had already passed, and we had no idea how much longer could pass. And then I read Romans. God will bring to ruin those who are ruining the earth. And there are no ifs and no buts in that verse. And, well, actually, I read it before, of course. I didn't become atheist and then suddenly start reading the Bible. But what this is saying is that we cannot have this laissez-faire attitude towards our planet. So one of the values I took from deconversion was that I had an obligation to have a responsible attitude of stewardship towards the planet that we live on, which meant cutting my carbon footprint, eliminating driving if I could. As it happens, I've eliminated driving altogether. I no longer have a car at all. I use a bicycle for short journeys. I don't go anywhere that is particularly distant from me. If I did want to, there are trains locally and buses for intermediate journeys. And of course, if I was going abroad, then I have a plane I can use, as the airport's not that far away. But I would consider whether I would want to start paying carbon offset for having travelled by plane, so that I would subscribe to a program where I am having trees planted or something, that the amount of carbon that I used in flying is offset by some environmental action that will draw that carbon back out of the atmosphere. And that's not perfect either, because it's not, strictly speaking, a equal ratio. But it's better than nothing. It's better than most people are achieving. So I can only aspire to leave the world a better place than I found it. And I can only aspire to leave myself a better person than I was when I was growing up. I have a more responsible attitude towards other people. I have a healthier relationship with other people. And I have a responsible attitude towards the planet and its environment as I go about the course of my life. I hope that's enough of my story, Sean, to satisfy your video. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.